6 years I'd farmed that land in peace. Then one Tuesday night, everything changed. Karen's cat got a scratch on its paw. By morning, my barn was ash. Neighbors gathered, whispering, filming on their phones. I stood there calm, watching smoke rise. Karen smiled like she'd already won. She had no idea who was coming to investigate. My name is Mara Whitfield, and Whitfield Farm has belonged to my family since before Silver Creek Hollow existed. I raise goats, grow heirloom tomatoes, and sell honey at the county market every Saturday morning. I live alone since my husband passed, with my old sheepdog Duke for company. The farm isn't much, but it's mine. Grandfathered into the HOA decades before Karen Voss ever bought her McMansion next door. Karen Voss became HOA president 2 years ago, and from day one she treated Silver Creek Hollow like her personal kingdom. Lawn height, mailbox color, even wind chimes fell under her scrutiny and her endless string of violation notices. My farm predates the HOA covenant entirely, protected by an agricultural easement recorded in 1987. Karen hated that she couldn't touch it, and she made that hatred known at every board meeting, every fence line conversation, every passive-aggressive smile. She started small, crowing too early. Another about the smell of compost drifting toward her prize-winning rose garden. I answered everyone politely, citing the easement, and she seemed to despise my calm more than my chickens. Karen's cat, a fluffy white Persian named Duchess, wandered freely despite HOA rules banning unleashed animals that applied to literally everyone else's dogs. Duchess treated my barn like her personal hunting ground, stalking mice among my hay bales. I never minded Duchess visiting. She was gentle, and my goats ignored her entirely. I even left a saucer of cream out some mornings, a small peace offering I never told Karen about, since peace wasn't something she seemed to want. Behind the friendly waves, Karen was quietly building a file on me. Denise, the HOA treasurer, later admitted Karen kept a folder labeled Whitfield, thick with photographs, timestamps, and notes nobody else on the board had ever seen. Roger, Karen's husband, was different, quiet, apologetic, always mouthing sorry when she wasn't looking. Once he brought over a jar of my honey and admitted, almost in a whisper, that living with Karen's temper wasn't easy for anyone, including him. The real trouble started when Karen tried to get my agricultural easement revoked, claiming the county records office had made an error decades ago. She hired a lawyer, quietly, without telling the rest of the board what she was planning. I found out through Hell, the HOA secretary, who slipped me a copy of the filing out of guilt. Karen wanted my barn rezoned as residential, which would have forced me to remove every animal I owned within 90 days. I fought the filing with county records proving the easement was airtight. Karen lost that battle publicly, at a town meeting, in front of 40 neighbors. She sat rigid, jaw clenched, while the county clerk read my documents into the record. That humiliation, more than anything, seemed to light something in her. Neighbors told me later she stopped attending the same book club as 3 women who'd sided with me, calling them traitors to the neighborhood standards behind their backs. Karen began parking her car directly at my fence line, engine idling, just watching. Duke would bark until she finally drove off. I chalked it up to spite. Or spite could carry a person. One afternoon, she cornered me at the mailbox cluster and said, almost sweetly. Everyone loses eventually, Mara. Even farms. I laughed it off then. In hindsight, it was the clearest warning she ever gave me, and I missed it completely. My part-time job, the one Karen never asked about, kept me away most weekday mornings. I told neighbors only that I worked for the county. Nobody pressed further. Farmers minding farms wasn't interesting gossip in Silver Creek Hollow. Denise once asked why a county badge sat in my truck's cup holder. I said it was for market inspections. That wasn't quite a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and I let the ambiguity protect me for exactly this reason. Karen's next move was quieter and crueler. An anonymous complaint to animal control claiming my goats were diseased and dangerous. An inspector came, found healthy animals and immaculate records, and left apologizing for wasting my afternoon. I didn't need proof it was Karen. The complaint mentioned details only someone watching closely from her property line could have known, like the exact number of goats and the color of my newest kid's collar. Still, I kept the peace outwardly. I brought her a jar of honey after the animal control visit, a gesture of goodwill. She took it without a thank you, set it on her porch rail, and let it bake in the sun. That small cruelty told me everything. Karen wasn't interested in resolution. She wanted submission, and my continued existence on that easement was, to her, an unforgivable act of defiance against the tidy little empire she'd built. By late spring, the HOA newsletter ran a community values piece that never named me but described certain properties dragging down curb appeal. Everyone knew exactly who it meant. Karen had found a new weapon, public shame. The spark, when it finally came, was almost absurdly small. Duchess chased a barn mouse into my old tractor shed and caught her paw in a loose fan belt, yowling loud enough for Karen to hear from her yard. Karen sprinted over, scooped up Duchess, and screamed that I'd set a trap for her cat. There was no trap. Place for months. Exactly the kind of hazard any barn naturally has. The vet's report, which I later obtained legally, showed a minor sprain, nothing broken, no laceration requiring stitches. Duchess was walking normally within 2 days. Karen told every neighbor a very different, far more dramatic story. By that evening, Karen had posted in the community group chat that my negligent, filthy farm had nearly killed her cat, and that something needed to be done about people who don't belong in a decent neighborhood. Comments piled up fast. Some neighbors defended me, remembering years of free honey and babysat chickens. Others, newer to Silver Creek Hollow and only knowing Karen's version, called for the HOA to finally deal with the farm. I tried reasoning with her directly, knocking on her door with the vet report in hand. She wouldn't open past the chain lock, hissing through the gap that I was trespassing on her porch. On land I could see was clearly hers. Roger appeared behind her, mouthing another apology I couldn't quite hear. Karen slammed the door before I finished a sentence. I left the vet report tucked in the frame, evidence for a fight I didn't yet know was coming. The next HOA meeting turned into a spectacle. Karen stood at the podium, voice trembling with practiced emotion, describing Duchess's near-death experience, while conveniently never mentioning the vet's actual, far calmer diagnosis I'd already emailed the board. Hal quietly showed me on his phone that Karen had, in fact, received that email. She'd simply chosen not to read it aloud, letting the board vote on outrage instead of facts. exactly the way she preferred every decision made. The board voted 7-2 to send me a formal notice demanding I remediate hazardous conditions within 30 days or face fines escalating to $500 weekly. My easement protected the animals. It didn't protect me from harassment. I appealed, attaching the vet report, time-stamped photos of the shed, and a maintenance log proving I'd already ordered a replacement belt before the incident. The appeal committee, stacked with Karen's allies, denied it within 24 hours. Denise later confessed she'd voted to deny only because Karen cornered her in the parking lot beforehand, reminding her whose signature approved Denise's home renovation permit last spring. Karen collected favors the way other people collected recipes. I started documenting everything myself, folder by folder, the way my actual job had trained me to. Photos, timestamps, emails. I told myself it was just for the appeal. Some part of me suspected I'd need it for something bigger. Karen escalated online, tagging local news pages with photos of my unsafe farm, carefully cropped to hide the new fencing, the fresh paint, everything that would have undercut her narrative of neglect and danger. A local reporter actually called me curious. I gave her the truth, calmly, with documentation. She never ran the story. Karen, turned out, had already fed her a version first, and editors rarely chase two competing farm stories in 1 week. Meanwhile, Duchess healed completely within a week, hopping onto my porch rail one morning like nothing had happened. I fed her cream again, and, incredibly, called it luring my cat as a hostage. That accusation reached the sheriff's non-emergency line. A deputy came out, looked at a cat drinking cream in the sun, and left shaking his head. Karen wasn't laughed at to her face, but everyone in earshot understood how far she'd gone. I began sleeping poorly, replaying every interaction, wondering what escalation came next. Duke started sleeping by the barn door instead of the porch, an old dog's instinct I should have paid closer attention to at the time. A note appeared on my truck windshield. Some fires start by accident, others don't, and signed, block letters, clearly disguised handwriting. I photographed it immediately and locked it in my truck's glove box instead of throwing it away. I didn't call the sheriff yet, before I involved anyone, especially given who I actually was during my weekday hours, a fact I still hadn't shared with a single neighbor in Silver Creek Hollow. The fines started arriving weekly, exactly as threatened. $500 stapled to a form letter with Karen's signature at the bottom. I paid the first 2 under protest, keeping every receipt, every envelope, every postmark date. By the 3rd week, I stopped paying and filed a formal complaint with the county's HOA oversight office instead, attaching the vet report, the appeal denial, and photographs proving my compliance with every actual safety code that applied. Karen found out within a day, likely from someone inside the oversight office itself. She showed up at my gate that evening, Duchess-free this time, and told me flatly that I was making a mistake I'd regret. I asked her directly if that was a threat. She smiled, the same smile from the mailbox cluster, and said, "It's just neighborly advice, Mara. Farms burn down all the time out here. Old wiring, dry hay. Who could ever say why?" I recorded that conversation on my phone, tucked in my jacket pocket the whole time. It wasn't admissible evidence of intent by itself, but it painted a picture, and pictures matter enormously once an actual investigation begins. The Oversight Office scheduled a hearing for 6 weeks out. Standard bureaucratic pace. Karen used those weeks efficiently, rallying board allies, printing flyers about protecting property values, and quietly researching. I'd later learn exactly how insurance claims worked. Denise mentioned, almost offhand at the grocery store, that Karen had asked her husband, a claims adjuster, several oddly specific questions about outbuilding fires and depreciation schedules. Denise thought nothing of it then. I thought about it constantly once I heard. Roger started avoiding eye contact with me entirely, crossing the street when he saw me walking Duke. Guilt has a particular posture, shoulders curled inward, and Roger wore it like a heavy coat that whole final month before the fire. I upgraded my barn's smoke detectors anyway, an old habit from my job that had nothing to do with Karen specifically. I also, quietly, installed 2 motion-activated cameras aimed at the shed and the barn's east entrance. Nobody in Silver Creek Hollow knew about those cameras. I hadn't decided yet whether I was protecting my farm or building a case. And honestly, at that point, those 2 goals had become nearly the same thing. A second anonymous note arrived, taped to my mailbox this time. Last warning. Get rid of the animals or something worse happens. I turned this one over to the sheriff's office immediately, alongside the first, both bagged separately. Deputy Reyes took my statement seriously, more seriously than I expected. He mentioned, carefully, that his department had gotten similar odd complaints about Karen from a prior neighborhood years back, before she'd moved to Silver Creek Hollow at all. I asked him what he meant. Of an old, unrelated file, but suggested I keep documenting everything, and gave me his direct cell number instead of the general precinct line, which told me plenty. That night I couldn't sleep, so I pulled county property records for Karen's previous address, a town 2 hours north. I found a name, Teresa Alcott, listed as a prior owner of a small orchard property that no longer existed. I didn't reach out yet. Paranoid farmer chasing ghosts. But I saved the name, the address, and the date the orchard's parcel had been rezoned vacant residential after some undocumented incident years earlier. The hearing date crept closer, and Karen's flyers multiplied, now featuring an exaggerated photo of my hazardous tractor shed alongside stock images of house fires, implying a connection that legally bordered on defamation I hadn't yet decided to pursue. Hal quietly warned me that Karen had asked the board to approve emergency discretionary funds for legal fees, framing it as protecting the community from my negligence, though the actual target was clearly my agricultural easement itself. I began attending every board meeting in person now. Calm, documented, unshaken. My presence visibly rattled Karen, who fumbled her talking points twice, once referencing a fire code section that, when I checked later, didn't actually exist. Denise's husband, the claims adjuster, mentioned to Denise that Karen had called their office asking, hypothetically, what happened to insurance payouts if a property owner couldn't prove exactly how a fire started. Denise finally grew uneasy enough to tell me herself. I thanked her and said nothing more, but that detail sat in my stomach like a stone. Karen wasn't just harassing me anymore. She was researching outcomes, weighing consequences, preparing for something specific she hadn't done yet. I called the county fire marshal's office, my actual employer, and requested informally, off the books, that my property be flagged for a routine voluntary safety inspection, the kind any farm can request, creating an official record before anything happened. My colleague, Marshal Reyes, no relation to the deputy, just a coincidence of small towns, came out personally, inspected everything, and signed off on full compliance. That inspection report, dated and notarized, would matter enormously later. Karen saw the marshal's truck in my driveway and immediately posted online that I was under investigation, twisting a clean inspection into implied wrongdoing, a habit of hers that consistently mistook other people's calm for guilt. I let the rumor stand uncorrected. Sometimes the smartest move is silence. Letting someone overplay their hand while you quietly gather everything you'll need for the moment the story finally flips in your favor. The hearing finally arrived. I presented the vet report, the inspection certificate, the time-stamped photos, and the 2 threatening notes. Karen presented a motion, volume, and a printed photo of Duchess's paw wrapped in a small blue bandage. The oversight panel ruled unanimously in my favor, dismissing every fine and formally reprimanding the HOA board for procedural overreach inconsistent with recorded easement rights. Karen's face, in that moment, went the color of old ash. She didn't speak to anyone on her way out, didn't wait for Roger, just walked straight to her car and drove off fast enough that Hal joked, uneasily, that her tires probably left marks on the parking lot pavement. I should have felt relief. Felt the same cold unease Duke had been showing all month, sleeping by the barn instead of the porch, refusing his favorite spot for reasons dogs somehow always understand before people do. That night I checked both cameras twice before bed, an old habit reinforced by 12 years in fire investigation. Nothing looked wrong. A clear sky. Hay bales stacked exactly where I'd left them. I told myself the hearing had ended it, that public humiliation would finally push Karen toward retreat instead of retaliation. I was wrong about that, in a way that would nearly cost me everything I'd spent my life building. 2 quiet weeks followed. HOA meeting entirely, and rumors floated that she was reconsidering her role as president after the oversight ruling. Silver Creek Hollow, for once, felt almost peaceful again. Neighbors who'd sided with Karen started softening, a few even apologizing quietly for believing the worst without checking facts first. I accepted every apology graciously. Grudges are expensive to maintain, and I had a farm to run. Duchess started visiting again, healed completely, chasing barn moths in the evening light. I let her. Cruelty. The cat had done nothing wrong, and punishing an animal for a person's spite never sat right with me. I nearly took my second camera down, telling myself the danger had passed. Something stopped me, some quiet professional instinct that 12 years of fire scenes had trained into my bones. I left both cameras exactly where they were. Roger, surprisingly, waved to me one morning, the first friendly gesture in months. He said Karen had been different lately, quieter, spending long hours in her garage workshop where she made scented candles to sell at craft fairs. I thought little of the candle hobby then. Karen had always liked hobbies that let her control small, contain things perfectly, wax and wicks bending exactly to her will in ways the rest of her life stubbornly refused to. The county held its annual harvest fair that weekend, and I sold out of honey by noon, a genuinely good day after a genuinely hard season. Several neighbors thanked me publicly for handling everything with such grace. Karen attended too, standing near her candle booth across the fairground, watching my line of customers with an expression I couldn't quite read. Pride would have been too generous a word. It looked closer to calculation. That evening, driving home, I passed her house and noticed her garage light burning well past midnight. An odd hour for candle making. I didn't think much of it then. I think about it constantly now, replaying every detail. Denise texted me the next morning, worried, saying Karen had resigned from the HOA presidency abruptly, effective immediately, citing personal reasons, in an email that struck Denise as strangely calm for someone who'd fought so hard to keep that title. I felt something shift, an old instinct sharpening. People who suddenly stop fighting publicly haven't always given up. Sometimes they've simply decided the fight belongs somewhere quieter, somewhere the HOA bylaws can't reach or restrain them anymore. I called Marshal Reyes, my actual coworker, and asked him, casually, whether our office had received any unusual permit requests near Silver Creek Hollow lately. He said no, but promised to flag anything involving my address specifically. That night, I walked the property line myself before bed, checking fences, checking the shed, checking the barn doors twice. Duke walked beside me, hackles slightly raised near Karen's fence. A warning I chose, finally, to take seriously. 3 nights later, my phone's camera app pinged at 2:47 a.m. I opened it groggy, expecting a raccoon. Instead, I saw a figure at the tractor shed, moving fast, carrying something long and dark against the moonlight. I was already dialing 911 as I grabbed a jacket, Duke barking wildly beside me. By the time I reached the porch, orange light was already licking up the shed wall, faster than any accidental fire I'd seen in years. The figure ran before I could get close enough to identify them clearly, vaulting the back fence toward Karen's property with an athleticism I hadn't expected from anyone in Silver Creek Hollow, least of all a 50-something HOA president. Fire trucks arrived within 11 minutes. My old colleagues from the county department, faces I recognized instantly even through the chaos. Marshal Reyes himself led the response, calling my name the second he saw me standing in the driveway. The tractor shed was a total loss by the time the flames were controlled. The main barn, thankfully, survived with smoke damage only, thanks to a firebreak gap I'd insisted on building years ago against exactly this kind of spread. My goats, penned safely in the far paddock, were unharmed, though terrified. Duke stayed pressed against my leg the entire night, shaking, refusing to leave my side even when the last truck finally pulled away near dawn. Reyes pulled me aside once the scene was secured, his expression careful. "Mara," he said quietly, "this wasn't an accident. I need you to walk me through everything, and I mean everything, starting with those cameras of yours." I handed over both memory cards without hesitation. The footage was grainy, moonlit, but clear enough to show a figure's build, gait, and the unmistakable outline of a container splashing liquid along the shed's exterior wall before igniting it. Reyes confirmed what I already suspected professionally. The burn pattern showed accelerant use, low and fast along the base, nothing like the slow, uneven spread of an electrical fault or a spontaneous hay combustion incident. The county's actual investigation opened formally the next morning. And here's the twist: nobody in Silver Creek Hollow had ever bothered to learn about their quiet, honey-selling neighbor, I wasn't just a farmer with a county badge in her cup holder. I am Deputy Fire Marshal Mara Whitfield. 12 years with County Fire Investigations. Currently assigned, as of that very morning, to the arson case involving my own burned tractor shed. A conflict of interest my supervisor addressed immediately. My supervisor, Chief Alvarez, pulled me from directly leading the case but kept me looped in as the victim, insisting I not investigate my own fire personally while still allowing me full access to every finding as it developed. Marshal Reyes took lead instead. An old friend and colleague who knew exactly how thorough I'd want the process to be, and who understood immediately why this case mattered to me on a level far deeper than professional duty. Word spread through Silver Creek Hollow within a day. The quiet farm woman everyone had underestimated was, in fact, a state-certified fire investigator. The exact kind of professional now examining every inch of the fire Karen had allegedly walked away from unnoticed. Denise called me, stunned, admitting she genuinely believed I just worked some county desk job. Hal laughed nervously on speakerphone in the background, saying Karen had picked possibly the worst neighbor in America to threaten with fire. Karen, notably, said nothing publicly at all. No online post, no denial, no outrage. Her silence, after months of constant commentary about my farm, struck nearly everyone as far louder than anything she could have written online. Roger, however, showed up at my gate 2 days later, visibly shaken, saying only, "I don't know everything, Mara, but I know she's been different since the hearing. Please be careful," before walking away without further explanation. Reyes and I carefully, professionally, with Chief Alvarez's sign-off, began building the timeline, the threatening notes, the hearing loss, Karen's abrupt resignation, and the suspiciously well-timed midnight candle workshop sessions Denise had mentioned weeks earlier. The accelerant recovered from the burn debris was sent to the state crime lab for chemical analysis, a process that typically takes 2 to 3 weeks. An agonizing wait made worse by knowing exactly how thorough that lab actually was. In the meantime, I pulled the old file myself, off the clock, on Teresa Alcott, the prior owner of that orchard property near Karen's old town. I found a phone number, still active, and finally made the call. Teresa answered cautiously, and once I explained who I was and why I was calling, her voice changed entirely. "Karen Voss," she said slowly. "I haven't heard that name in 6 years. I hoped I never would again." Teresa told me her small orchard had burned under nearly identical circumstances. A property dispute with Karen over a shared fence line, escalating complaints, and then a fire investigators at the time ruled undetermined due to insufficient evidence. "She was never charged," Teresa said, "because we couldn't prove intent. I sold what was left for almost nothing and moved states away. I've spent 6 years wondering if I imagined how deliberate it all felt." I asked if she'd be willing to speak with our investigators formally. She hesitated, then agreed, saying quietly, "If she's done this again, somebody finally needs to stop pretending these things just happen to people who cross her." I passed Teresa's information directly to Reyes, who flagged it immediately as a critical pattern of behavior lead, the kind that transforms a single undetermined fire and a fresh active case into something prosecutors take far more seriously together. Karen, unaware of Teresa's resurfacing, resumed limited public appearances, attending church Sunday morning with Roger, smiling thinly at neighbors who now noticeably kept their distance, the community's warmth toward her cooling by the day. Denise resigned from the HOA board entirely, citing exhaustion, though she admitted to me privately that watching Karen's calm mask crack even slightly after the fire had finally convinced her something was deeply, seriously wrong beneath it. Hal remained on the board, determined, he said, to clean house properly once the investigation concluded, and began quietly compiling his own record of every questionable vote, fine, and favor Karen had extracted during her presidency. I focused on rebuilding what I could of the shed. Insurance adjusters walking the property twice that week. Careful and thorough, cross-referencing everything against Marshal Reyes's official findings before approving even preliminary reconstruction estimates. Karen's husband's connection to insurance claims resurfaced in my mind constantly. I mentioned it to Reyes, who confirmed he'd already requested records of any calls Karen made to insurance offices in the months before the fire. Those records, once subpoenaed, showed exactly what Denise had described. 3 separate calls from Karen's personal cell to her husband's firm, each asking increasingly specific hypothetical questions about outbuilding fires, salvage value, and burden of proof standards. Reyes called it consciousness of a plan, legal language for evidence suggesting premeditation rather than a sudden, emotional act. Arson born from a single burst of rage looks very different, forensically, from arson someone had quietly researched for weeks. The lab results finally arrived. The accelerant was a specific paraffin-based fire starter. Uncommon in typical households but extremely common in one very particular hobby, the exact kind of scented candle-making supplies Karen kept stocked in her garage workshop. Reyes obtained a search warrant for that garage within 48 hours, citing the accelerant match, Teresa's prior pattern, the insurance inquiries, and my camera footage showing a build and gait consistent with Karen's height and stride. I wasn't present for the search, kept at arm's length professionally as the victim, but Reyes called me that evening, his voice carefully neutral in the way investigators use when they found something significant they can't yet fully discuss. What they found, he eventually told me once the paperwork cleared, was a nearly identical container of the same paraffin accelerant, partially used, tucked behind Karen's candle supplies, alongside a receipt dated 2 days before my fire. They also found, backed up automatically to a cloud account Karen apparently forgot existed, deleted footage from her own driveway security camera, the one she'd installed, ironically, to monitor suspicious activity near my property line. That deleted footage, recovered intact from the cloud backup, showed Karen leaving her garage at 2:31 a.m. the night of the fire, carrying a container, and returning 16 minutes later without it, moving with the same distinctive gait my camera had captured. Karen was formally brought in for questioning the following morning. Calm at first, insisting she'd simply gone for a late walk the night in question. A claim that unraveled the moment Reyes played both camera angles side by side. She asked for a lawyer almost immediately after that, her composure finally cracking in a way neighbors would later describe as unrecognizable. Nothing like the confident, controlling woman who'd run Silver Creek Hollow for 2 years straight. News of her arrest spread through the neighborhood group chat within the hour, and the same people who'd once cheered her Community Values newsletter now scrambled to distance themselves, deleting old comments about my hazardous, negligent farm. Denise texted me a single line, "I should have listened to my gut months ago. I didn't respond right away." There wasn't much comfort I could offer someone who'd simply been outmaneuvered by a very practiced manipulator. Roger, notified by police as Karen's spouse, reportedly broke down during his own brief interview, admitting he'd suspected something the night of the fire but had been too afraid of her temper to say anything at the time. He later told a mutual acquaintance that he'd found candle-making receipts and burn residue on Karen's gardening gloves the morning after, but chose silence, terrified of what confronting her directly might have cost him personally at home. That admission, once formalized in a statement, corroborated the timeline perfectly. Motive from the hearing loss, means from the workshop, opportunity from the 2:31 a.m. footage, and now a witness confirming suspicious physical evidence the very next morning. Karen was charged with first-degree arson, and prosecutors, armed with Teresa's prior case, began quietly reviewing whether additional charges related to the older, undetermined orchard fire could finally be pursued under a pattern of conduct statute. Bail was set high given the premeditation evidence, and Karen posted it within a day, retreating to her house under a media blackout Roger arranged. Though Silver Creek Hollow's group chat needed no press coverage to spread every detail. I received a call from the district attorney's office asking me to prepare a formal victim impact statement. An odd, layered experience given that I'd also, unofficially, been part of gathering the very evidence now building against her. Reyes joked, gently, that I'd essentially solved my own arson case from the victim's chair. Something he said had never technically happened in his 15 years with the department, and hoped never would again after this. Karen's extreme unraveling had only just begun, though cornered, exposed, and facing real consequences for the first time in years. She stopped hiding behind polite HOA language entirely and let her true desperation show completely. She began calling former board members late at night, according to Hal, pressuring them to remember things differently if subpoenaed, hinting at old favors, old debts, old secrets she'd quietly collected during her 2 years as president. Denise received one such call and, badly shaken, recorded it on her own phone, capturing Karen threatening to reveal Denise's improperly permitted renovation unless Denise agreed to testify that the fire could have been an accident all along. Denise brought that recording directly to Reyes rather than comply, a decision that added witness tampering to Karen's growing list of charges and effectively destroyed any remaining sympathy the HOA board still quietly held for her. Karen next targeted Teresa Alcott directly, tracking down her new address through a mutual acquaintance and sending a letter warning her not to drag up ancient history that has nothing to do with anyone anymore. Teresa, unshaken, forwarded that letter straight to prosecutors, who added it as evidence of ongoing intimidation, strengthening the connection between the old orchard fire and my burned shed far more than Karen could have possibly anticipated. Roger finally moved out, staying with his brother 2 towns over, telling neighbors only that he couldn't live under the same roof anymore, a statement everyone understood without needing further explanation given everything already public. Karen, now isolated, began appearing at odd hours near my property line again. Despite a temporary protective order Reyes had helped me file the moment the intimidation pattern became clear to everyone involved in the case. My cameras caught her twice more, simply standing at the fence, staring at the rebuilt shed frame, motionless for nearly 20 minutes each time. An image Reyes described as someone watching their own consequences take shape. I reported both violations immediately, and each one added weight to the case against her bail conditions. Prosecutors arguing successfully that Karen posed an ongoing risk to the very witness whose testimony had helped expose her. Her bail was revoked following the second fence line incident, and Karen was taken back into custody, this time with no quiet release the following morning. No quiet retreat behind Roger's media blackout to soften the blow. Neighbors who'd once decorated their lawns to match Karen's community values, newsletter suggestions, now avoided even walking past her empty house. Its garden slowly overgrowing. This candle workshop light dark for the first time in years. Al, now acting HOA president by default, called an emergency meeting to formally review every fine, every violation notice, and every discretionary fund Karen had authorized during her tenure, a process that took considerably longer than anyone expected. What Hal found was staggering. Nearly $40,000 in legal consultation fees, funneled through a firm that, on closer inspection, existed almost entirely to pursue my agricultural easement revocation, funded quietly by inflated HOA dues nobody had questioned. Several neighbors demanded refunds once this surfaced, and the board, under new leadership, agreed to reimburse a portion, a small but symbolic reversal of the financial pressure Karen had spent 2 years applying almost invisibly. Denise, meanwhile, testified formally against Karen regarding the witness tampering call, her voice shaking on the stand but her account precise, corroborated exactly by the recording she'd handed over the moment Karen crossed that final line. Teresa flew in for a deposition, meeting me in person for the first time outside a courthouse hallway, both of us recognizing something familiar in each other's exhausted relief. 2 women finally allowed to stop being afraid. She almost got away with it twice, Teresa told me quietly. The only difference this time is you happen to be exactly the kind of person she could never successfully lie to about how a fire actually starts. The forensic accountant assigned to the HOA financial review confirmed Hal's findings, formally referring Karen's misuse of association funds to the district attorney as a separate potential fraud charge, stacking onto an already substantial list against her. Karen's lawyer attempted a plea deal, offering guilty pleas to lesser charges in exchange for dropping the witness tampering count. Prosecutors, holding Denise's recording and Teresa's letter, declined, confident the full case would hold at trial. I continued rebuilding the shed during all of this, each new beam a small, physical rebuttal to everything Karen had tried to burn away, both literally and in every quieter, more insidious way she'd attempted before the fire itself. Duke, finally, started sleeping on the porch again instead of guarding the barn door all night, a small sign I chose to read as the farm, and maybe I myself, finally beginning to feel safe once more. Marshal Reyes told me, off the record, that in his career he'd rarely seen a case with this many independent, mutually reinforcing pieces of evidence, camera footage, cloud backup, chemical analysis, prior pattern, and witness tampering, all converging on one person. Most arsonists get caught because of one mistake, he said. Karen made about 6, because she genuinely believed nobody watching her would ever be thorough or credentialed enough to actually put them together the right way. The trial date was set for late autumn, and Silver Creek Hollow, oddly, grew quieter in the interim, as if the entire neighborhood was collectively holding its breath, waiting to see whether its own carefully built order would finally be restored. I received an unexpected letter from a woman 2 counties over, someone who'd read about the case in a regional paper, describing a strangely similar HOA dispute with a different president entirely, asking whether patterns like this were just how these things go. I didn't have a comforting answer for her, only the truth, that control, once unchecked long enough, tends to escalate exactly this way, and that documentation, patience, and simply refusing to be intimidated matter more than people realize. Karen's extreme final act, ironically, came from behind bars. She attempted, through a cellmate's outside contact, to have someone quietly approach me with an offer to drop my victim impact statement in exchange for money from a hidden account. That approach, clumsy and easily traced, was reported immediately, adding attempted bribery of a witness to a list of charges that now read less like an HOA dispute and more like a genuinely staggering criminal indictment. Reyes told me, almost bewildered, that Karen seemed constitutionally incapable of simply stopping, that every attempt to manage the consequences of her actions only generated fresh, independently prosecutable consequences of their own, compounding endlessly. By the time jury selection began, Karen faced arson, witness tampering, attempted bribery, financial fraud related to the HOA funds, and a renewed formal investigation into the 6-year-old Orchard Fire prosecutors now felt confident enough to finally pursue. I spent the weeks before trial reviewing my own statement obsessively, wanting it precise, factual, free of anything a defense attorney could twist into emotion overriding evidence. The exact standard I'd held every case to for 12 years professionally. Reyes prepared his testimony alongside the state's forensic chemist, walking the jury, in rehearsal, through the accelerant match step by step, the same methodical process that had originally identified the fire as deliberate rather than accidental. Teresa prepared to testify about the Orchard Fire, nervous but resolute, telling me during one phone call that finally being believed, after 6 years of silent doubt, mattered more to her than any specific legal outcome could. Denise, too, prepared to testify about the tampering call, quietly proud. She admitted that she'd chosen the harder, honest path instead of protecting her own renovation permit the way Karen had clearly expected her to. Hal compiled the full financial misconduct timeline into a binder for prosecutors, thick with receipts and board minutes, evidence that Karen's control over Silver Creek Hollow had been built on quiet coercion nearly as much as public charisma. Roger, subpoenaed as a witness, agreed to testify honestly about the morning after the fire, the gardening gloves, the residue, admitting finally that fear of Karen's temper had kept him silent far longer than his conscience should have allowed. The morning of the trial arrived cool and clear, the kind of quiet autumn day that felt almost deliberately calm compared to everything building toward it. I drove to the courthouse alone, Duke waiting patiently at home. The gallery filled early, neighbors from Silver Creek Hollow filling nearly every seat, some out of genuine support, others clearly out of simple curiosity about how far Karen's carefully maintained image had actually fallen since the fire. Karen entered in a plain gray suit, hair pulled back tightly, none of the polished HOA president polish she'd once worn like armor at every meeting, every hearing, every carefully staged neighborhood photo opportunity she'd orchestrated for years. Her lawyer opened by framing the fire as circumstantial, suggesting the camera footage was ambiguous and the accelerant match coincidental, a strategy that visibly faltered the moment prosecutors previewed exactly how much corroborating evidence actually existed. The prosecution's opening statement laid out the timeline plainly. Motive from the easement hearing, means from the candle workshop, opportunity from the 2:31 a.m. footage, and a pattern stretching back 6 years to an orchard nobody had connected until now. I testified first among the fact witnesses, walking the jury through the vet report, the threatening notes, the fines, and finally the fire itself, keeping my voice level even as I described watching flames climb my family's barn wall. The defense attorney tried, briefly, to suggest I'd fabricated the notes myself for sympathy, a claim that collapsed instantly once the state entered the handwriting analysis matching Karen's own documented HOA meeting notes into evidence. Marshal Reyes testified next, methodical and unshakable, walking the jury through burn patterns, accelerant chemistry, and the specific paraffin blend traced directly to Karen's own candle-making receipts purchased 2 days before the fire occurred. The defense's cross-examination attempted to challenge Reyes's chain of custody on the accelerant sample. He answered every question calmly, citing exact protocols, and the challenge visibly failed to shake even a single juror's expression of growing certainty. Teresa Alcott took the stand next, her voice steady despite 6 years of buried fear, describing her own orchard fire, Karen's escalating fence dispute beforehand, and the eerie, unmistakable similarity to everything now facing this jury directly. The defense objected repeatedly to Teresa's testimony as prejudicial prior conduct, but the judge allowed it under the pattern of conduct statute, ruling the similarities too significant and too specific for a jury to reasonably ignore. Denise testified about the tampering call next, playing the recording aloud in open court, Karen's own voice filling the room, threatening exposure of a renovation permit unless Denise agreed to soften her account of events. Watching Karen's face as her own recorded voice played back was, according to Hal sitting beside me, the first time she looked genuinely, visibly frightened rather than merely inconvenienced by everything unfolding around her that week. Roger testified last among the key witnesses, his voice breaking slightly as he described finding residue on Karen's gloves, admitting his silence, and confirming the timeline that placed her squarely at the scene the night of the fire. The defense's closing argument leaned heavily on reasonable doubt, suggesting an unidentified third party could theoretically explain the footage. Prosecutors countered simply, no other person had motive, means, opportunity, and a documented prior pattern all at once. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours, a relatively short window given the case's complexity. A fact Reyes told me afterward usually signals a jury that found the evidence overwhelmingly, uncomplicatedly clear from the very beginning. I waited in the courthouse hallway during deliberations, Hal and Denise beside me, none of us speaking much, all of us watching the closed jury room door as though staring hard enough might somehow speed the verdict along. Teresa waited too, having stayed for the full trial despite living hours away, saying quietly that after 6 years of wondering, she needed to be physically present for whatever finally happened in that courtroom that day. Word came just after 4 in the afternoon that the jury had reached a verdict, and the gallery filled back in fast. The same mixture of support and curiosity from the trial's opening morning now sharpened into anticipation. Karen stood as the verdict was read, her lawyer beside her, Roger notably absent from the defense side of the room, having chosen, in the end, to sit quietly among the witnesses instead of beside his wife. The foreperson read the counts one by one. Guilty of arson. Guilty of witness tampering. Guilty of attempted bribery. Guilty of financial fraud related to HOA funds. Each word landing heavier than the last across the silent courtroom. The orchard fire charge, requiring a higher evidentiary threshold given its age, resulted in a guilty finding as well, The jury, clearly persuaded by Teresa's testimony and the undeniable pattern connecting both fires across 6 years. Karen's composure finally broke completely, a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob escaping her as the final guilty count was read, her lawyer placing a steadying hand on her shoulder that she immediately shrugged away. The gallery stayed silent, per courtroom decorum, though I felt Denise's hand find mine, gripping tight, and heard Hal exhale slowly beside me. Months of quiet fear finally, visibly releasing from his shoulders all at once. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Standard procedure allowing time for pre-sentencing reports, victim impact statements, and a final accounting of every financial and physical harm Karen's actions had caused across 2 separate communities. I spent those 6 weeks finishing the shed's reconstruction, the new beams standing straighter and stronger than the original ever had, a physical rebuttal that felt, finally, complete rather than merely defiant against what had happened. Teresa called twice during that stretch, once simply to check in, and once to ask, almost shyly, whether I'd consider selling honey at a farmer's market near her new home sometime. A small, hopeful gesture toward normal life. Roger reached out one final time, an email rather than a visit, apologizing plainly for his silence and confirming he'd filed for divorce, saying only that he hoped, eventually, Silver Creek Hollow could genuinely heal from everything. Hal, formally elected HOA president in a landslide vote, immediately proposed dissolving the discretionary legal fund entirely and instituting transparent, publicly reviewed HOA finances going forward, a motion that passed unanimously without a single dissenting voice. Sentencing day arrived colder than the trial had been. Gray clouds pressing low over the courthouse parking lot as I walked in beside Teresa, Denise, and Hal, all 4 of us finally, formally standing together in daylight. Karen appeared thinner, older somehow, in the same gray suit from the trial, her lawyer beside her once more, though this time no crowd of loyal HOA allies remained to fill the seats behind the defense table. The judge invited victim impact statements first, and I stood, unfolding the pages I'd revised a dozen times, describing not just the fire itself but the 2 years of quiet, escalating cruelty that had led directly to it. I spoke about Duchess's minor injury weaponized into a false emergency, about the fines, the fake violations, the threatening notes, and finally about watching flames climb a barn wall my family had maintained for 4 generations. Teresa spoke next, her voice steadier than I'd heard it in any of our prior calls, describing 6 years of quiet doubt finally resolved. 6 years of believing she'd somehow imagined the deliberateness of her own orchard's destruction. Denise spoke briefly about the tampering call, about choosing honesty over protecting her own renovation permit, and about how frightening it had felt to realize how much quiet leverage Karen had accumulated over ordinary, well-meaning neighbors. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence available under the combined charges, citing the pattern spanning 2 properties, 2 communities, and 6 years, along with the aggravating factor of witness tampering committed while already facing arson charges. The defense requested leniency, citing Karen's lack of prior convictions on paper, carefully avoiding any mention of the orchard fire that had simply gone unprosecuted rather than never having happened at all 6 years earlier. The judge, reviewing the full record before delivering sentence, noted specifically the calculated, researched nature of the fire, referencing Karen's insurance inquiries and candle supply purchases as evidence this was premeditation rather than a single moment of rage. Karen was sentenced to 11 years for the combined charges, with the possibility of parole after 7, alongside a full restitution order covering my shed's reconstruction costs, Teresa's orchard losses, and the misappropriated HOA funds Hal had documented. She showed no visible reaction to the sentence itself, sitting rigid as bailiffs approached, though Roger, seated quietly among the witnesses rather than beside her, finally allowed himself to look away entirely as she was led out. The courtroom emptied slowly afterward, Teresa hugging me tightly in the hallway, both of us finally exhaling years of accumulated tension neither of us had fully realized we'd been carrying until the exact moment it was over. Denise thanked me quietly for not blaming her for the votes she'd cast under pressure, and I told her honestly that recognizing manipulation after the fact took more courage than most people ever managed to summon at all. Hal mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Silver Creek Hollow's next community newsletter would finally focus on actual neighborhood events instead of values language designed to shame specific residents into silent compliance with one woman's preferences. I drove home that evening past Karen's overgrown garden, past the dark candle workshop window, and finally, past my own rebuilt shed standing solid and unburned against the same evening light that had once shown it in flames. Duke greeted me at the gate the way he always had, tail wagging, completely unaware of courtrooms or verdicts, caring only that I'd come home again, exactly as reliable and uncomplicated as farm life had always genuinely been. I sat on the porch that night with a cup of tea, watching Duchess-less shadows settle over the property, and realized, for the first time in 2 years, that I finally felt no need to check the cameras twice. The following spring, my rebuilt shed hosted its first full harvest storage. Hay bales stacked exactly where the old ones had been. A quiet continuation rather than merely a replacement of everything Karen had tried to erase. Teresa did visit that farmer's market near her new home, and I drove up with a truck full of honey jars. The two of us finally meeting under circumstances that had nothing at all to do with fire or fear. Denise took over the HOA's finance committee formally under Hal's presidency, instituting the exact transparency measures Karen had spent 2 years quietly avoiding, and neighborhood trust, slowly, visibly, began rebuilding itself meeting by meeting. Roger's divorce finalized quietly that summer, and he moved away from Silver Creek Hollow entirely, sending one final short note thanking me, oddly, for never once treating him with the same suspicion Karen's actions had genuinely earned. My colleagues at the fire marshal's office occasionally referenced the case in training sessions, an unusual example of a victim whose professional expertise had helped identify the exact evidence needed to finally, conclusively close 2 separate cases at once. Karen, from prison, sent one letter early in her sentence, unopened by me on Reyes's advice, forwarded instead directly to the prosecutor's office in case it contained anything relevant to her ongoing restitution or parole eligibility review. I never learned what it said, and honestly, I stopped wondering fairly quickly. Some doors, once closed properly through an actual courtroom process, don't need reopening just to satisfy lingering curiosity about a person's final excuses. The insurance settlement, once finalized, covered nearly the full reconstruction cost, and the restitution order insured Karen's remaining assets, including the Silver Creek Hollow house she'd once ruled from, went toward repaying both Teresa and me directly. Hal used part of his new presidency's mandate to formally rename the HOA's Harvest Festival after longtime residents rather than board members, a small gesture that nonetheless marked a genuine, visible shift in the neighborhood's priorities. I sold that year's honey harvest entirely at the county market and the new farmers market near Teresa's town, splitting weekends between the two, finding a strange, hard-earned peace in simply being known now as a farmer again. Nothing more. Duke grew old peacefully over the following years, sleeping wherever he pleased, porch or barn, no longer guarding against a threat that had finally, fully, been resolved in a courtroom rather than left to fester unspoken across a fence line. Occasionally, a new neighbor moving into Silver Creek Hollow would ask about the old rumors. The burned shed, the HOA president who'd gone to prison, and Hal would simply say, "Ask Mara. She's the one who actually knows the whole story." I tell it plainly when asked, without embellishment, because the truth, laid out fact by fact, camera footage, chemical analysis, prior pattern, needed no exaggeration to land exactly as heavy and satisfying as it had actually felt living through. The county eventually asked me to speak, informally, at a regional fire investigators conference about the case, framing it as a study in how patience, documentation, and refusing intimidation could ultimately outlast even a determined, resourceful antagonist. Standing at that podium, describing Karen's escalation from fines to threats to arson, I finally understood the full shape of what those 2 years had actually been. Not just harassment, but a slow, deliberate test of exactly how far unchecked control could reach. Karen had believed, I think, that a quiet farm woman with honey jars and an old sheepdog would simply fold under enough pressure. The way she'd apparently expected Teresa to fold years earlier. The way she'd trained her own HOA board to fold routinely. What she never accounted for was the specific, unglamorous expertise sitting quietly in my truck's cup holder the entire time. The kind that reads burn patterns instead of rumors, and trusts chemical analysis over whoever simply shouts loudest at a meeting. Reyes, at that same conference, joked to the audience that the real lesson of the case was simple. Never assume your quietest neighbor lacks the exact professional training required to methodically prove precisely how and why your fire actually started. I laughed along with the room, but privately I thought of Duke's raised hackles months before the fire, of Teresa's 6 lonely years of doubt, and of how close unchecked cruelty had come to simply being written off as bad luck. Denise eventually became HOA treasurer permanently, applying the same careful scrutiny to budgets that she'd once, briefly, applied to justifying votes she regretted, determined never again to let intimidation substitute for actual honest deliberation among neighbors. Hal served 2 full terms as president, remembered locally less for any single achievement than for simply, consistently, refusing to let any one resident's temper dictate community policy the way Karen's temper had quietly dictated policy for 2 years straight. Teresa eventually replanted a small section of her old orchard property. Now under new ownership she'd befriended, saying the first blossoms that spring felt less like closure and more like proof that some things genuinely do grow back. My own farm settled into its old rhythms. Goats, honey, market Saturdays, Duke eventually passing peacefully of old age one autumn, buried near the rebuilt shed in a spot he'd guarded so faithfully during the hardest year of both our lives. I got a new dog eventually, a scrappy mixed-breed puppy Duke, in spirit if not in name, would probably have approved of who now sleeps wherever he pleases, having never once needed to guard against anything at all. Silver Creek Hollow's HOA newsletter, under Hal's editorship, eventually stopped mentioning community values altogether, focusing instead on actual events, harvest festivals, book club meetings, and, occasionally, updates on Whitfield Farms' award-winning honey at the county fair. Karen remains incarcerated as of this telling. Her parole hearing still years away. Her restitution payments arriving slowly, mechanically, through the state's processing system. Quiet, unglamorous consequence for what had once felt like an unstoppable campaign of control. Roger sent one final holiday card the year after his move. No return address, just a short note wishing me well, which I read once, appreciated quietly, and then filed away alongside the rest of a chapter genuinely closed. I think, sometimes, about how close the whole thing came to going differently. If I hadn't installed those cameras, if Reyes hadn't taken the notes seriously, if Teresa had never answered an unfamiliar number from a stranger 2 states away. Every piece mattered. Every small, patient, documented decision. And I've come to believe that's the real lesson beneath all the drama. Quiet thoroughness, sustained long enough, eventually outlasts even the loudest, most determined attempt to bend a community by force. The shed stands strong today, hay stacked high, goats grazing peacefully in the paddock beyond it. Duchess long since rehomed happily with Denise's family, chasing entirely different barn mice under an owner who actually deserves her. Silver Creek Hollow, for all its old drama, feels genuinely like a neighborhood again. Honest disagreements settled at actual meetings instead of through anonymous notes, fake complaints, or midnight visits with containers of accelerant hidden in the dark. I still sell honey every Saturday. Still wear my county badge quietly. Still answer, I work for the county when asked. Though now, occasionally, a neighbor smiles and adds, the county's lucky to have you, and genuinely means it. Karen Voss learned, far too late, that the woman she'd spent 2 years trying to burn out of her own family's land happened to be exactly the person most qualified in the entire county to prove precisely how that fire started. Some fires end everything they touch. Others, against every intention behind them, end up illuminating exactly the truth someone was desperately trying to keep buried. One careful piece of evidence at a time. Whitfield Farm still stands. Honey still sells. And somewhere in a state facility, Karen has 11 long years to consider that the fire marshal investigating her case had, in fact, been living right next door the entire time. The END.